Guadeloupe is a paradise island in the Caribbean Sea. A longtime colony of France, the tragic history of slavery in the territory dates back to the 17th century. How does Guadeloupe live now? Is the era of slavery over for this territory? Who do locals think they are?
I live 8,000 kilometers from France. I don't see how my land can belong to France. We still live in colonization and it's deep in our heads.
They were taking you out of Africa. You were considered a thing, like a piece of furniture. So you meant nothing to them. You weren't considered human. In fact, you were something of an animal.
Colonization is not over. I would even say that slavery still exists. We live in modern-day slavery. Slavery didn't go anywhere. It's still here.
We are in Guadeloupe, which is a French territory in the Eastern Caribbean, although the modern population is of Negroid race. This was because in the 35th year, when France came to this territory, they exterminated the local Caribbean population, organized cane plantations here, and to work on these plantations, slaves from African territories were brought in.
The colonists came to the islands with their sores, their bacteria, their viruses, and it ruined the Indians extremely fast, much faster than the war did. And those who survived were taken prisoner. They were turned into slaves on their own islands, so the first people enslaved in the Caribbean were local Indians.
Disons que quand les colons sont arrivés,
when the first Spanish colonists arrived, they arrived with their own way of life. They had diseases that the inhabitants of the Lesser Antilles had not yet encountered and for which we had no cure. And it destroyed a lot of our people.
notre peuple.
When did the era of slavery begin? Why the people of Africa? Why did they come to Guadeloupe in the first place? Because the Caribs were not strong and numerous enough, and this people refused to become slaves. They refused to surrender to slavery. Then women as well as men committed suicide. All because they didn't want to be enslaved.
It has an ideal climate for growing sugarcane and coffee. But the Indians couldn't cope, so the white conquerors figured out a way out pretty quickly. They began bringing slaves from Africa to the plantations.
Ships called slave ships were leaving Europe, be it France, Portugal, or the United Kingdom. Especially cities like Liverpool, Marseille, Nantes, Bordeaux. The ships were bound for the west coast of the African continent. These ships carried the goods that are featured in this showcase. Fabrics, utensils, weapons. In fact, little things that in the eyes of Europeans were of little value.
Des armes, des petites choses en fait qui aux yeux des Européens n'ont pas beaucoup de valeur, si bien qu'on...
That's why we would call them junk too. So the ships are loaded with all this stuff. They stay on the west coast of the African continent.
Côte ouest du continent africain, là-bas, ils échangeaient le contenu des cales contre...
There they traded the contents of the holds for women, men and children. They would drive them into the holds of ships, and then the ships would set sail and go to America.
Ensuite, le bateau, il partait pour arriver dans les Amériques.
They could be sold either in North America, the United States, the Caribbean, or even South America. So there in the markets of the French islands, captives were sold and became slaves. And sold to the owners, and the ships, the holds became empty again. And they were filled with food that came from the colonies.
Les bateaux, les cales sont de nouveau vides et on remplissait.
There was powder, indigo, sugar. Sugar was in that form at that time, and also tobacco and cotton. These products were placed on the ship and they would put to sea again and go to Europe. These three stages, Europe, Africa, America, ships passed endlessly. Once the colony's products arrived in Europe, they became insanely valuable.
Ces étapes-là, ces trois étapes, Europe, Afrique, Amérique, ben les bateaux le faisaient inlassablement. On a essayé de représenter...
This is what the slave cabin looked like. As you can see, the area of the hut is small, and you can sleep in it when you stop working in the factory or in the fields. The whole family lived in one room, the roof was made of straw, and the walls were made of wood. If you look more closely at the walls, you'll notice that the wood is woven in such a way that you can see what's going on inside from the outside. Following this logic, dehumanization, and even calling one's home one's own dwelling, one's freedom of action is still limited. He is always being watched by someone, including his closest neighbor. The floor of the house is made of clay. In reality, more often than not, people were lying on the ground. The hearth was located outside the dwelling to avoid fire.
We were being taken to the Caribbean as a labor force. So when slaves were brought in, the slaves had to serve the masters, and the masters were always white men. They were either white French gentlemen, white Englishmen, or white Spaniards. And when you disobeyed your master, he beat you like a dog.
C'est quand même issu de la colonisation parce que il y avait un degré.
In the days of the slaves, they had a certain gradation. You had slaves to work in the fields and to do chores around the house. There were different types of slaves. Initially, there wasn't much fabric, so those who worked in the houses were at least somewhat clothed. And those in the fields wore more revealing clothing. To hide the attractiveness of slaves, nightgowns called house clothes were commonly worn in homes. If we had to go out, we wore something more closed. It was also called a corset outfit. It covered the woman's figure as much as possible. We were given this, and we were taught this during colonization. And then our women seamstresses, mothers, and so on, they sewed with their hands, improved, making the dress only more beautiful. And now we have this.
Parce qu'elles faisaient de la couture à la main, elles ont reproduit, amélioré, les rendre beaucoup plus belles. C'est ce qu'on a connu, c'est comme ça que c'est devenu une mode chez nous.
The forced settlement of Guadeloupe with slaves has resulted in most residents not knowing their ancestors or even where those ancestors came from. We don't know for certain.
We know, but vaguely. It's only now that we're beginning to take an interest in it because we've been alienated. I really don't want to open up and reveal my views on our religion and all that. But for a long time, our population followed customs that weren't meant for us to keep.
So it's like searching for yourself when you don't know who you are.
Everything is unclear, blurry.
To move forward, we need to know where we come from. To have a solid foundation, that's what I believe.
If you don't know your origins, you lose yourself. You're in ignorance.
At some point, you start to wonder, why am I here?
C'est quoi ma mission?
C'est quoi ma mission, voilà. Alors mes racines, moi dans ma famille, on a pu remonter.
Where's my foundation? I have tried to explore my roots. In my case, I was able to trace my family tree back to an ancestor's personal number. There wasn't much beyond that. Basically, a personal number is now considered the starting point for every person from the African continent.
Par exemple, sur le continent
We mustn't forget that.
Ou même ailleurs, parce qu'il faut pas oublier. Du côté de ma mère, je n'ai aucune idée
I have absolutely no idea what country my ancestors were from, where we came here from. Who are my distant ancestors? Where did they live? Senegal, Congo, Mali. Maybe Benin? I have no idea. I don't know. I've been robbed of my roots. None of us know. I try not to dwell on it because it's lost.
Parce qu'il faut bien se souvenir que l'article 44 du Code noir.
A slave had a name and number under which they were recorded in their master's property register. I'll remind you that Article 44 of the Black Code stated that an enslaved person was movable property, and therefore not a subject of law. And after slavery was abolished, the commissioner came to give names specifically to former slaves. These names were often whimsical in nature. Here's Rosina, for example. Her number is 4,400. The commissioner gave her the name Africaine, primarily because she was a slave from among those recently brought from Africa. She wasn't a slave born in Guadeloupe on her master's property. That's why she was called African. That name evolved into a surname that exists to this day. And there are many people like that on this list. You will find people with surnames like Farmer Friendly. The commissioner chose names based solely on his whim.
Mais en fait, le commissaire de la République a fait ça selon sa bonne volonté.
The history of slavery in Guadeloupe is perhaps the most tragic. Slaves were movable property. Their life expectancy did not exceed 7 years. Slaves did not have surnames, only nicknames given by their masters when purchased or baptized. There was a set of laws called the Black Code. According to Black Code, every slave had to be baptized into Christianity.
Par la force des choses, vu qu'ils étaient interdits de pratiquer la religion.
Due to circumstances, given that they were forbidden to practice their religion, and because they were gradually brainwashed with new religions, generation after generation they forgot their nature-oriented religion and started practicing a new alien one.
Jusqu'à aujourd'hui, même pratiquer cette religion au quotidien.
My whole family, including myself, is Christian. I am against Christianity because it is false, and I cannot follow a religion that was cruel and unfair to my ancestors. It is simple. I cannot follow a religion that suppressed other beliefs because it was forced upon my ancestors.
After the abolition of slavery in 1848, France was forced to find new cheap labor. A huge number of people from India and the untouchable caste became that labor.
When slaves first gained freedom, they no longer wanted to work for those who had beaten them for 200 years, which is understandable. So now the French colonists had to find a new workforce, and they came up with a brilliant idea. This time, instead of going to Africa for labor, they would choose from the lower castes of Indian society. That is, among the untouchables, people who had nothing to lose. And they would tell them, we will give you a better life. And so on. And that is how, between 1854 and 1882, the French state would send over 42,000 people from India to Guadeloupe.
Donc pourquoi ils sont venus? Vous savez, après l'abolition de l'esclavage.
You see, it was a kind of evolution of slavery, and slave owners saw it all coming. They approached the French authorities in advance to find labor. They would need a workforce, otherwise cane production would have come to a halt. It was a workforce that could easily be deterred from striking. People who did not know the language, a buffer between slaves and slave owners Indians.
Nos grands-parents ont amené.
The plant that our grandfathers grew is called curry leaf. It is very often used in cooking due to its high content of vitamins and other substances. I'm referring to Indian cuisine in Guadeloupe. If you come over, you can smell it. It's highly prized in Indian cuisine for its taste and aroma, and people used it even when they could have paid for it with their lives when local authorities banned its use.
C'est une histoire parce que entre la France et l'Angleterre.
It's quite a dramatic story because there was an agreement between France and England. France abolished slavery and all slaves were freed, but the settlers needed labor to work on the plantations. So France looked for people all over the world, wherever there were people. People who were slowly dying, beggars who had never eaten their fill. They were essentially treated as commodities to be imported here. And so they found the Indians. Indians are a peaceful people. They don't have a rebellious spirit.
Trouver des Indiens. On a dit des Indiens, ils sont dociles, ils sont tranquilles, ils sont calmes.
They'll be our workers capable of accepting harsh and difficult working conditions. The Indians started coming. The former slaves saw the Indians as competitors and enemies. A certain form of racism towards Indians developed among whites, settlers, and masters. Indians were treated as indentured servants. All the Indians were told that a contract was being signed with each of them for exactly 5 years, and after 5 years they were promised to be sent home at the employer's expense. At France's expense, but no one returned, no one was brought home to this day. That's how my great-grandmother never came back either. The day her grandchildren told her, the very next day she took poison. She was found dead. She killed herself because she couldn't go home. She lived with hope in her soul that she would one day return home. When you were hired, unlike a slave, you were paid, but you were paid the minimum. To buy a horse or cow, you had to save for 5 years. At that time, a horse or cow cost 10 times less than it does now.
Ou alors une vache. Il faut économiser pendant 5 ans. Et à l'époque, un cheval ou une vache coûtait 10 fois rien.
44,000 people came from India. 600 people died during the journey. The rest arrived and were distributed to various farms. When they were allocated, relatives and sisters were not allowed to work together. They were sent to different plantations so they couldn't unite.
En prenant soin, s'il y avait des frères et des sœurs, de les séparer.
By the way, colony in Latin means land taken on lease. Guadeloupe can be classified as a raw and resettlement colony raw because the colonizers established cane production here, and resettlement because the local population was exterminated and slaves from Africa were brought here.
And all power was given to the descendants of white colonizers, the so-called Békés.
The Békés are still in power. The Békés own most of the businesses on the island and they lobby the authorities in Paris. they support the interests of the Élysée Palace here in Guadeloupe.
Avant d'incriminer la France, moi les premiers à incriminer...
Before blaming France, which does not fulfill its obligations to the people, to the country, I would first blame the descendants of the slave traders, because they are the ones with the economic power today. They are the ones who set the prices in the supermarkets. That's why life is expensive. And why do they keep supermarket prices so high? Because they want to unite their population. After all, the poorer the population, the more aid from Europe. In fact, European funds are focused on the poverty of the population. And the poorer the population, the more Europe pays.
Bekes is what they call the descendants of slave owners here. The word consists of the main parts Blanc and Creole, white Creole. The first European population of the Antillean Islands.
Si vous avez le temps, vous verrez qu'il y a des quartiers où on voit que des blancs, ou une majorité de blancs.
You'll see neighborhoods that are white only or where most whites live and neighborhoods with more blacks. Here, all the bank managers, company directors, people with money, people with a lot of land are white. And among these white people are those we call Bekes. This nickname comes from Nigeria. The Bekes ancestors were island colonists and slave owners here and in Martinique. Whites continue to own the land, own most of the banana plantations on the islands. They're especially numerous in Martinique. They've settled in very well. If you're white, if you're from France, it's easier to get a bank loan, easier to buy a house, easier to get a job and all that. No doubt everybody knows about it, everybody sees it. What we call the legacy of colonialism is everywhere.
Et tout le monde le sait, tout le monde le voit. Ça, c'est ce qu'on appelle les séquelles du colonialisme.
En que toujours on y a abat, on peut que yo pas qu'à douter yo. En que toujours choper yo à la patte pendant les collègues qu'a shooter yo. Toujours que plus fort qui fasciste que j'ai tout ni caniche sans ni mémoire nous que toujours ni racine. Nous c'est descendants esclaves. Mais il y a des inégalités qui sont flagrantes.
There are glaring inequalities in the country. For example, problems with access to housing, jobs, healthcare. But above all, the fact is that France continues to plunder our ancestral lands. I am talking about the situation specifically in the overseas territories and in the parts of Africa where France still has a presence. Many of France's riches are not on its own territory, but France appropriates these goods only for itself. Slaves were forbidden to sing, but they still sang covertly among themselves. The slaves never stopped singing. They didn't want to give up their culture and their roots. Singing was the only way to feel like themselves, but it was forbidden. These were songs of hope, songs of freedom.
Se sentir eux-mêmes, mais oui, c'était interdit. C'était des chants d'espoir, c'était des chants de liberté.
Ma mère qui était toute anti-indépendantiste.
My mother was against independence. She was right-wing and didn't want to hear anything about slavery. She said it was all in the past. We should forget about it. What's there to talk about? How are we still talking about this? She was ill, now she's no longer with us. She was shaking so much during the surgery that she had to be strapped down. I was nearby and heard her say, half delirious, "I don't understand why they're tying me up, why they're tying me down." Only blacks get tied up like that. She didn't remember saying such a thing afterwards. It's ingrained in our subconscious, it's in our soul, in our shared collective memory. Slavery is very much imprinted on us.
Personally, I don't know why I should be here in this status. I don't consider myself French, so tell me who I am. I just have French documents, because France decided it had to be that way. They're forcing us, but their actions towards us are not done with love or joy.
I don't agree that one people can belong to another. When I'm told that a Guadeloupean is French, it implies that Guadeloupe belongs to France. I don't understand how a country or island can belong to another country. I don't understand how a people can belong to another people. We are told to be French, to feel French. We are told that Guadeloupe is part of France. But France was never part of Guadeloupe. If I was born 8,000 kilometers from France, I'm not French. France has spring, summer, winter, and autumn, while we don't have changing seasons. It's 30 degrees all year round. We never get cold here. We don't wear puffer jackets. We have our own climate, our own culture, our own history. We are who we are. We are distinct people. I'm not French and my ancestors weren't Gauls.